And I looked at this photograph and I went quite cold, because behind them there was a tall Norfolk pine tree. And in my dream, I had seen that tree. In early September of 1989, I woke up having had a very vivid dream. And I knew the dream was from the Lord. And so I wrote it down in my journal. Because I was a young mum with 4 small children, and I knew if I didn't write it down then, I would forget the detail. The dream was about a house, and I wrote at the bottom of my journal, I believe we'll live in this house one day. So I wrote it down, packed the journal away, and nearly forgot about it. Until a friend of ours, really good friends of ours, were looking for a place in San Francisco, and they felt the Lord had told them to look for a large house where they could start their ministry and raise their family all at the same time. And so they sent out communications to friends all over the world saying, this is what we believe God has told us to do, to look for this large house. And if you've got any input that you feel is from God, let us know. So this was pre-email days. And so a friend of mine, a local friend of mine who knew these people in San Francisco as well, said to me, Margie, you need to fax them the dream. So I faxed them the dream, and they got all excited, and they said, this is the house that God wants us to get. And so they started looking, and they looked in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they couldn't find the house. And eventually they said, well, we just have to rent a big house and move in, which they did. And then a couple of months later, friends of theirs from Kona in Hawaii, people involved with YWAM, got hold of them and said, we have a facility that we're not using, a YWAM facility, and we want to use this facility for a ministry to the world of business and government. And we think you might be interested, because our friends had a ministry to the world of business. And so they flew out our friend, and he walked through the house, and he was amazed, because the house seemed to be the house that I'd had a dream of. So he called me in South Africa. And the most amazing thing was, it was the beginning of September, 7 years later, almost to the day that I had written down that dream. And he said to me, Margie, are you sitting down? I have some news for you. And I was sitting down. I was sitting on the steps next to the telephone, because in those days you couldn't move around with a phone. Can you imagine that? It was a wired phone, and you had to sit in one place and speak on the phone. He said, I found the house. I said, oh. He said, it's in Hawaii. I said, oh. Hawaii to me was one island called Honolulu with palm trees and people who did the hula. And I had done a geography minor at university, and I still didn't realize that Hawaii was a group of islands. It was half the way around the world from South Africa, a long way away. Anyway, they flew me out to see the house. And it was quite scary driving up the long driveway, because I thought, what happens if it's not the house that I had the dream of? Anyway, we spent a week consulting with people from YWAM, praying, asking the Lord whether we should start a ministry there to the world of business and government. And I realized that I didn't actually have to make the decision, that God would speak to the group, and that gave me a lot of peace. The interesting thing was that in the dream I had there were specific details, architectural details, and certain plants in the garden that I'd seen in the dream. The house that I had seen in the dream was actually a single-story house. It didn't have 2 stories, but the house that we saw was 2 stories, and that had a question mark for me. And so I wondered about that. 3 or 4 days into our visit, the caretaker of the house said to us, would we like to see the original plans of the house? So we went into a back room, he unrolled the plans, and there was a single-story house. So I felt the Lord giving me peace that actually he knew every detail and I didn't need to worry about it. Other architectural details were as I'd seen in the dream. So we moved there for 6 months. Don, my husband, took sabbatical leave from his lecturing position at a college in South Africa, and we moved there for 6 months as a trial period to see whether we felt this was the right thing to do, and make a permanent move. Then, during those 6 months, we started a history of this old Hawaiian plantation house. It was over 100 years old. And so we asked the grandchildren of the people who had built the house to come and to be interviewed by us. And it was very interesting because they came with their old photograph books, those albums that had black pages and the photographs were put in with little corners. And one lady came and we were having tea at the end of the lanai, and she was showing us her photographs, and then she stopped on one page and there was a photograph of a young couple sitting in the corner on the railing on the corner of the lanai. And I looked at this photograph and I went quite cold because behind them there was a tall Norfolk pine tree. And in my dream I had seen that tree. But when we moved there, the tree was not there. And so it had been a question mark in my mind. And I thought, Lord, what happened to that tree? So I said to the granddaughter, tell me about that photograph and tell me about that tree. So she said, that's a photograph of my parents getting engaged. And so I said, well, where's the tree? And she said, oh, that must have been cut down after we sold the property. She said that tree was very significant. People would come during the early days of the house in the early part of the 1900s. They would see the tree and they'd come on horseback because people didn't have cars in those days. And that house was a center for provisions, for medication. People would come for advice. It was like a place that people came to. So they saw the tree and it was a landmark. So I thought, okay, there's the tree. Then there were a couple of other little details that needed to fall into place, and God in his faithfulness showed me every single one of them over that period of time. So there was no doubt in my mind that God had called us to Hawaii to live in that house through a dream that I had had 7 years before we actually even started the process of going there. And we lived in that house for 4.5 years, and we're still based in Hawaii 22 years later.